With a name like WickedBinge, it's no secret that we love ourselves some villains. So when a franchise like Despicable Me comes out with a ton of them, we're like kids in a candy store. Or in today's case, like kids in a courtroom. Because today we're going to be sentencing every Despicable Me villain for their crimes. We'll be going through these villains roughly in order of introduction. So kicking off our list is none other than the despicable he himself, Lalosevic. Granted, he isn't so despicable anymore. He's not only a pretty great dad, willing to dress as a fairy princess for his daughter's birthday party, but he even works to take down sinister villains with the Anti-Villain League. That kind of influence is enough for us to conclude that he's more than likely to be forgiven for his past crimes, which I'm totally not saying just because we sentenced him for those in an earlier video, but would you believe us if we said that even Gru's hero arc had a few questionable moments? Well, first and foremost, Gru is guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. Granted, none of us were booing him for freezing Margot's two-timing date Antonia with his iconic freeze ray, but that doesn't change the fact that Gru could have potentially killed the 12-year-old kid here, even if he was a rude one. In Despicable Me 3, he has another oddly satisfying crime, that being a hit-and-run collision with an absolute alpha male who wanted to show off his car's ability to extend and retract its wheels like a pair of stilts.
Come on, this is gonna be fun!
These are petty crimes, sure, but they're still done by a guy who's basically a government-employed superhero. Verdict. Look, Gru, you're a good guy, but you just can't go around using your superpowered weaponry on anyone who mildly irritates you. I'm not saying it isn't funny, it just isn't legal. Taking the state laws and possible damages into account, we sentence Gru to a mild sentence of $2,000 in fines and mandatory weapons safety classes. Next, we have Gru's partner in literal crime, Dr. Nefario. Now, he may be behind the scenes, but don't go thinking he's any less culpable as a result. He aids Gru and later El Macho with their villainous schemes.
What? So this is your new job opportunity? Absolutely. You're gonna like this.
In both cases, he performs irresponsible scientific experiments on the minions, who he also kidnapped one time, by the way, creating weapons that help to cause potential havoc in the world. He doesn't even bother to make sure his lab is safe and secure, like closing the lab's window before he tests a chemical that makes it float.
I meant to close that. He'll be alright, I'm sure.
Whether it's out of true malice or just forgetfulness, it's still an issue. He also doesn't seem too remorseful about essentially dooming the world when he teams up with El Macho, only regretting it when he sees that it's putting Gru and his family in danger.
I mean, I'm happy to create an evil army to destroy the world, but nobody messes with my family.
But this does result in Nefario having a redemption arc of sorts, helping to stop El Macho and later using his scientific gifts to cure Gru's son, Gru Jr. at the end of Despicable Me 4, thus undoing his cockroachification. But there's one more thing we need to take into account here. In Minions Rise of Gru, Nefario adds a significant crime to his list, that being child endangerment. By helping to connect Gru to the Vicious Six, he effectively kickstarts Gru's path to becoming a major villain in his own right.
If you ever get famous, remember who gave you your first gadget.
Even though both of them eventually improve as people, we still can't help but feel that some action is in order. Verdict. Now, while Nefario's crimes are mostly in the distant past, we still have to take into consideration just how much destruction he caused, or at least contributed to. We don't really feel that prison would be the answer for him though, so we sentence Dr. Nefario to a fine of $750,000. That should cover his damages, and it'll be enough of a hit to tell him that maybe he shouldn't be forcing little yellow dudes to help him test out his evil weapons. Now allow us to direct you with both direction and magnitude to our first true villain, Vector. Similar to Gru at the beginning of this movie, Vector is a bad guy who wants nothing more than to commit the most outrageous attention-grabbing crimes he can get. From landmark theft to animal cruelty, Vector will sink to just about any low he can reach in order to grab the attention of those around him. Public endangerment for the fact that this dude has a security system that points explosive rockets and other weapons of mass destruction at anyone who approaches, even if it's just a few little girls trying to sell cookies. But his worst crime easily comes at the movie's climax, in which we see Vector kidnap Marko, Edith, and Agnes in the hopes of extorting their father, putting them in a ton of danger with his recklessness.
That's me, because I'm committing crimes with both direction and magnitude. Oh yeah!
He even purposely tries to trap Marko on his ship for the sake of pettiness, leading to her nearly falling to her death. That adds on a charge of child kidnapping, attempted murder, and child endangerment. Verdict. Look, I love Vector as a villain, but even with that being considered, I feel like this guy is just too dangerous to be kept around. Heck, he wouldn't even accept the Minions' help to get back to Earth in the Moon Short, which resulted in him eventually getting stranded on Mars before finally making it back home, as he's seen in prison at the end of the fourth movie. With all of his crimes, plus his lack of remorse, we sentence Vector to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. Given how friendly he can be towards fellow villains, it's possible he could find some redemption eventually, but we're gonna need to give him a little bit of a trial period before we end up with another moon nap rapper on our hands. But every cloud has a silver lining. For example, Vector might be in jail for a long time, but we're sure that'll make Mr. Perkins one proud papa. As the Bank of Evil's owner and proprietor, Mr. Perkins is mainly guilty of one major crime, aiding and abetting. That goes for both Gru and Vector, two criminals who have committed grand theft on a worldwide scale. Mind you, that's not to consider their other crimes, nor is it even to consider the other criminals Mr. Perkins has helped.
I love everything about your plan, except for one thing. You.
As if this weren't enough, when Gru tries to get money for his plan to steal the moon, Perkins makes a very thinly veiled threat to murder him if he fails.
Let's say this apple is you. If we don't start getting our money back.
Adding a count of extortion to his record. Verdict. It should hardly need to be said that the Bank of Evil needs to go, but that's nowhere near enough to make up for what its owner has already done. So we're gonna have to sentence to Mr. Perkins to immediate shutdown of the Bank of Evil and either 30 years in prison or a $20 million fine. Finishing up the first movie's villains, it's time to go over Miss Hattie's crimes. Although not a villain technically, it can't be denied that she is a terrible person. All her crimes relate back to the treatment of the orphan children she takes care of. From the outside, Miss Hattie's home for girls may look like an altruistic deed done by someone who genuinely cares for children. But from forcing them to sell cookies to shoving them into a cardboard box for hours at a time whenever they anger her to just straight up telling girls they'll never get adopted, emotional abuse is the least of this lady's legal concerns.
You're never gonna get adopted, Ada. You know that, don't you?
We're gonna tack on multiple charges of child labor and extortion, given our tendency to threaten time in those aforementioned cardboard box prisons if the girls don't reach their quotas.
Hi, Benny. Hi, guys.
Verdict. At the very least, Miss Hattie doesn't seem to cross any physical lines. The bar is in actual hell at this point, but at least she's clearing it to some extent. Still, she more than deserves to lose her orphanage, even if she still provided the bare minimum of care. In addition to closure, we're gonna come down as hard as the US child labor laws allow. We sentence Miss Hattie to $100,000 in fines and 18 months in prison. It may not be the worst fate out there, as again, she doesn't quite do enough to get any major amount of jail time, but it'll still give us the wicked stepmother wannabe her just desserts. Now let's move on to the sequel's villain. It's that masculine menace himself, El Macho. Ironically, El Macho is probably the least evil of the series' main antagonists in terms of intentions, but his list of crimes is one of the longest so far. Regarding his plan involving the minions, this was of course an act of mass kidnapping and brainwashing, not to mention the aspect of possessing illegal weapons of mass destruction in regards to the PX-41 serum. We also have all the terrorism that he planned on committing with his rabid minions, the attempted world domination, and even framing an innocent man. Had Gru and Lucy not stopped El Macho, Floyd Eagleson's life could have been ruined, and so therefore could the lives of many bald people. Oh yeah, I almost forgot, with all those super extravagant crimes, there was still his attempted murder of Gru and Lucy. Verdict. Man, El Macho had zero chill. Given how he came back from a faked death just to try and take over the world again, it's safe to say that literally nothing is gonna stop this guy from terrorizing the world however he can. As such, we're gonna have to sentence him to the death penalty, and this time he'll be riding two sharks strapped with more dynamite into a bigger volcano that's also strapped with dynamite. We're not taking any risks this time, sorry to the sharks. Before we let the minions take over the spotlight, let's finish up the original trilogy starting with Gru's wannabe villain twin, Gru. While he's a pretty fun character, Gru isn't really that effective as a villain. That's not to say he doesn't want to be, though. He's just, well, he just isn't. But thankfully, Gru's criminal ambitions aren't about world domination or terrorism or anything of the sort. Really, he just wants to steal stuff and flex about it. We see him steal 2 lollipops from an unguarded truck in one scene, so, petty theft, I guess. He also aided and abetted Gru's attempt to steal the diamond back from Balthazar Brat, but given what Brat planned to do with it, that's not even something we feel the need to punish. There's gotta be something more! Oh, right, during his candy theft, we see him, do some reckless driving, as well as running from law enforcement. That's something. Verdict. Honestly, Gru doesn't seem capable of genuinely harming anyone, and what's more, he's utterly terrified of going to prison. But we don't want him to feel bad, so here's what we'll do. We'll sentence Gru to mandatory psychiatric help and $500 in fines. It should be enough of a slap on the wrist to get him on the straight and narrow without being too overwhelming for the guy, and I'm sure Gru will be more than willing to help him with that fine anyway. Now let's move from a wannabe bad boy to a really bad boy. Balthazar Brat. As another charismatic man with a unique fashion sense, it's no surprise that Brat has a similar list of crimes to Vector, in both direction and magnitude. In fact, Brat's is arguably even worse. He shares Vector's crimes of grand theft, of a highly coveted diamond, and even that classic third act child kidnapping and endangerment, using the girls as bait to lure Gru and Lucy to him, which tacks on a charge of extortion. Mind you, this is all before we've even mentioned his grand plan, to use a gigantic robot to terrorize Hollywood and an even more gigantic wad of bubblegum to float it into outer space.
Hey, Clive, I guess you could say our plan was out of this world.
There's just no way around those charges of domestic terrorism, mass destruction, and attempted mass murder. Verdict. Really, we have all the justification we need to give Broth the death sentence, and we would if it weren't for one attribute: insanity. After Hollywood abandoned him, Balthazar Broth genuinely came to believe he was the character he played on TV.
I've been a bad boy.
Which led him down a dark path. We can empathize with him for that much, but whether he's insane or not, he's just too dangerous to be allowed back into human society. So we're sentencing Balthazar Broth to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But who knows, maybe he'll meet some of the bad guys he inspired in there. See, you can be caring while upholding justice. This next entry might seem a little unfitting since they aren't really antagonists, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the minions. The minions are psychologically built to serve the most evil master they can find. It's hard to fault them for that, as even if they are guilty of historical levels of aiding and abetting numerous dangerous criminals from Gru to cavemen to Napoleon Bonaparte, no, we're not joking about that, it's just the way they're built. They're also incredibly devoted to their masters, no matter how dastardly they are. In Minions, for instance, they try to apologize to Scarlet even after being wrongfully locked up in her dungeon and almost tortured by Herb.
Wow, harder than I thought.
There's also the little factor of the vandalism and mass destruction they get up to on a daily basis. I mean, we've mentioned it before, but Mega Minion Mel's laser literally cut through the entire planet. You'd think this would mean life in prison without a doubt, but we all saw in Despicable Me 3 that prison will not do a thing against these guys. And if we executed them, well, that's just really cruel, honestly. Forgive me if that's too soft-hearted, but we've got to find a different solution, right? Verdict. Well, here's my idea. The minions are really stupid, right? They still serve Gru even when he stops being particularly evil, so what if we had decent people pretend to be evil, then keep them as pets? It's a simple, rather unorthodox way of pet whispering, but it might just work. We sentence the minions to behavioral therapy and domestication. Keep them full of bananas and apples, and the things will be probably just fine. From the minions themselves to the movie's main antagonist, now it's time for the legendary villainess Scarlet Overkill. Famous among villains for the criminal empire she's been running since childhood, Scarlet Overkill is an absolute menace, and she doesn't even try to hide it. On the contrary, she works to be the most evil villain in history to gain the respect, or more accurately fear, of everyone around her. She makes a celebrity out of herself and her evil deeds, appearing as a special speaker at VillainCon. Said evil deeds include grand theft of a royal artifact, as well as attempted usurping of royalty. I'm already not sure how to even sentence that, but it gets worse when you consider her treatment of the minions. First of all, she extorts them by threatening death if they disappoint her, and second of all, she's fully willing to send the minions to be tortured and killed by Herb for betraying her, by which she means them simply getting the crown and immediately giving it to her like she wanted.
I was going to be the picture of elegance and class, and you pinheads screwed it up!
Even being proven utterly wrong about their betrayal, she still attempts to kill her underlings for a misunderstanding on her end. Verdict. It's obvious that Scarlet is totally unstable, lacks any sense of a moral compass, and we haven't even mentioned her years of terror and mass destruction before meeting the minions. We also didn't mention the fact that while attempting to kill the minions for misguided revenge, she caused mass destruction across England and presumably killed many, many people. Really, there's no doubt about it. We've got to sentence her to life in prison without parole, but we'll let her keep the little crown that Bob gave her. You can't be the Queen of England, Scarlet, but you can be the queen of your prison cell. While he's not nearly as evil, we can't neglect to mention her spouse, Herb Overkill. He's an extremely loving and loyal husband who will do anything for his wife. Unfortunately, while this is in and of itself a good thing, it's brought down by the fact that said wife is Scarlet, a pure evil villain who's absolutely proud of that fact. Herb is responsible for making most of Scarlet's equipment, including but not limited to weapons and even outright torture devices, which calls for a charge of aiding and abetting an international terrorist.
This is gonna be so fun!
While Herb does seem to be quite pleasant outside of Scarlet's influence, he is willing to follow any order she gives him, even torturing and attempting to kill the minions, who he was actually quite friendly with beforehand. Verdict. Herb might be friendlier than Scarlet by a long shot, but that doesn't make him any less loyal to her, and while he's far more likely to be susceptible to rehabilitation than his beloved wife, his devotion to her would almost certainly result in him trying to break her out. Still, we'll let them have each other at least. Life without parole it is. And hey, they're dancing together in the finale of Despicable Me 4. Looks like we're right on the money. Okay guys, bear with us. We're almost to the newest movie, but let's take a quick detour to the rise of Gru to talk about Wild Knuckles. He was the leader of the Vicious Six before he was callously betrayed by them due to his old age. We definitely feel for him there. We don't, however, sympathize with his years of committing notorious thefts, attempted murders, and the notoriously his kidnapping of Gru, who he holds hostage and tortures in an attempt to extort his former colleagues into giving him the medallion in exchange for his safe return. When it turns out that they don't actually care about Gru's safety though, Wild Knuckles starts to actually sympathize, taking Gru under his wing and teaching him how to commit crimes.
Wait till you see what I'm gonna teach you next.
He even saves Gru's life and nearly sacrifices his own, defeating his treacherous former crew. Verdict. It's rather unlikely that Wild Knuckles would get charged since, most of the world believes he's dead, but if the cops were to somehow get their hands on him, we have a feeling they'd feel indebted to to him for saving the city and possibly the world, not to mention the life of a kid who would go on to stop even bigger threats in the future. Still, Wild Knuckles gets 1 year in jail and a $1,000 fine for his past threats. This way, we can't say he got off scot-free, but we also can't say it's anything he can't handle. Heck, who's to say we won't accidentally leave his cell door unlocked? But while Wild Knuckles got off with a little bit of leeway, his former allies, the Vicious Five, formerly Six, aren't gonna get such an easy punishment. As members of Wild's crew, they share basically all the crimes he committed: theft, attempted murder, kidnapping, and torture. During the climactic battle, they earned that torture charge by essentially crucifying Gru on a clock tower, which would have had this literal child brutally murdered on full display as they destroyed the city.
Did you forget what time it is?
That surely has to count as both regular terrorism and psychological terrorism, right?
Verdict.
Look, we won't waste any time here attempting to kill an innocent child with no remorse while committing a major act of terrorism when you already have more than a few warrants out for your arrest. These five just earned themselves a quintuple death penalty. But without further ado, it's time to move on to the newest movie in the saga, starting with its secondary villain, Principal Übelschlecht. It's no surprise that the lady whose name literally translates to Principal Evil Bad has a pretty rough criminal record. For starters, well, she's the principal of Lycée Balsbon, meaning she's trained numerous villains in her lifetime, and her favorite student happens to be one of the most notorious criminals out there. There's no way that doesn't count as aiding and abetting criminals on a massive scale. How she's even able to run this school is anyone's guess, but I guess it's another Bank of Evil situation where the less we question it, the better. If running this school doesn't count enough, she also exposes the location of Gru's relocated family to Maxime Lemal, placing their lives in danger. Whether knowingly or not, this leads to the endangerment of civilians. Later on, she forces herself into Gru's home to await his return, which definitely counts as trespassing. And the fact that Gru's children are present at the time makes this even worse.
Verdict.
With how should we say this, experienced Übelschlecht is in the age category? Yeah, that's right. You might be deceived into thinking she's harmless, but that only makes her all the more dangerous, especially given how she managed to chase down Gru and go toe-to-toe with Lucy, all with the help of her high-tech wheelchair. What's more, as long as she's allowed to run that school, there's gonna be some serious trouble. We're gonna have to punish Übelschlecht by shutting down Lycée Balsbon and enforcing life in prison. Oh, and we're replacing that wheelchair with a normal one. Sorry, girl, you just can't be trusted with it. From, presumably, the oldest villain to the youngest, up next we have Poppy Prescott. Poppy is a ruthless teenage villain in training who wants to make an intimidating name for herself. That'll be a challenge with the name Poppy, but she gets a good start by blackmailing Gru into helping her with a heist under the threat of having his former supervillain status exposed. With Gru's help, she ends up breaking and entering into Lycée Balsbon, which is honestly kind of a gray area, morally speaking. I mean, she's literally trying to further her education. We can't fault her too much, right?
Oh no! I ruined our heist!
We can fault her a little bit for the stealing of their school mascot, Lenny the Honey Badger, earning her a mild charge of pet napping. While realistically none of these would lead to charges since both Lycée Balsbon and Gru have their own stuff to hide, Poppy could definitely get herself into trouble from an objective standpoint. That said, at the end of the day, she does end up proving herself to be a decent person. She helps Gru rescue Gru Jr. after he's kidnapped by Maxine, offering him a ride to catch up to him.
Verdict.
Poppy's villainous aspirations are definitely concerning, but on top of her good qualities, we have to remember that, despite anything else, she is still just a child. Given how quickly she shifts from a snooty blackmailer to a decent, altruistic anti-hero, it's safe to say she has the potential to avoid the path of villainy. As such, we sentence her to mandatory counseling and a $300 fine. It's not enough to mess up her life or anything, but it's plenty enough for a teenager to realize they might want to start changing their ways. Our second to last villain is Valentina, and she has but one crime under her individual belt: aiding and abetting. Valentina doesn't really do much of her own volition, she really just acts as support for her boyfriend.
Verdict.
But you probably know where this is going. For the fact that her boyfriend is a certain cockroach-themed bad guy, we have to sentence her to life imprisonment, especially given just how nonchalant she is about going along with his evil deeds. But now, without further ado, it's time to get to the newest and most evil villain in the franchise, Maxime Lemal. Let's see, for one thing, Maxime is guilty of unethical experimentation and mutilation. We can't really fault him too much for turning himself into a freaky part cockroach dude, but forcing that onto an innocent gas station worker is a step too far. Then, as if that's not bad enough, there's the final battle in which he transforms Gru Jr., a literal infant. This guy mutilated a baby, and to make matters worse, he planned this out. His main goal was kidnapping Gru Jr. as revenge on Gru for stealing his talent show idea in the 9th grade. This leads to him engaging in psychological terrorism and crimes against humanity during his pursuit of Gru, culminating in attempted murder during the climactic battle.
Verdict.
If it weren't for his and Gru's duet, I would say there's no silver lining in Maxime surviving. This guy committed some of the most depraved acts of any character in this franchise, and it doesn't even have the insanity plea that characters like Scarlet or Brat do. This guy's just petty, arrogant, and cruel. To make matters worse, he involved an infant child in his crimes, which no court's gonna go easy on. So our sentence for him is 3 simple words:
Finish the job.
Yeah, you know how the Mega Minions rode in on a stampede of bulls to trample him? Let's just do that again, but more intentionally. We saw from his first arrest that being put in jail only agitates this guy even further, so let's put that giant earth-shattering laser beam to good use. That ought to show you how unsquishable cockroaches really are, Lemal.